Ahoy, mateys! Welcome to Podcasts of the Caribbean, a podcast covering the world of Pirates of the Caribbean, from the theme parks to the movies and everything in between. My name is Justin Helmer, and I will be your host on this voyage through the Caribbean. It'd be too late to alter course now, mateys.
Hello and welcome back to Podcasts of the Caribbean. This is episode 28, and today we're continuing to make our way through Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides. So this is part 4 of our journey through this movie. If you have not listened to the first 3 episodes covering on Stranger Tides, you can go back and listen to those now. I highly suggest you do, so just so you know where we're at in the movie. Or if you want to start here, you're more than welcome to start here. And then, of course, we also covered the first 3 Pirates of the Caribbean movies at the very beginning of the podcast, so you can go check those episodes out. And if you also want to check out the episodes we did about the theme park ride and other expanded materials, you can also do that as well. But today, this is our 4th episode covering on Stranger Tides, and we have about 40 minutes left in the movie to cover. So I intend to get through the rest of On Stranger Tides in this episode, so we'll see how long this episode ends up being. I don't know how long it's going to be, so just stick with me. So let's get right back in On Stranger Tides, right where we left off. And if you remember last episode, we left off right after Jack and Barbossa went aboard Ponce de Leon's ship, the Santiago, and they were looking for the chalices, and they found that the Spanish already took the chalices from the ship. So Jack and Barbossa found out that the Spanish are probably making camp at this old fortress in the jungles. So Barbossa and Jack meet back up with Gibbs and the rest of the Providence crew, and they begin to make their plan to steal the chalices away from the Spanish. So right after that scene ends, that's where we stopped last time, we go over to the Queen Anne's Revenge crew in the dark of night, and they finally make it to the pools that Jack was mentioning last episode when Blackbeard asked, how close we were to the fountain. Jack said, about a day's march north, you'll reach a series of pools, then you're close. So they finally reached these pools, and Blackbeard goes next to one of them and he sees a dead corpse of a mermaid, so a dead skeletal mermaid that is tied to one of these tree branches, and they're dead. I mean, because they were left to die right here, which is pretty gruesome. But so Blackbeard says mermaids, and everyone has now come up to this location, and Blackbeard says, "Careful, these pools run deep. If she escapes, all is lost." So Syrena, of course, is now being brought here, and this is where they intend to harvest her tear, because if you remember what Angelica said last time, she said that the tears need to be fresh because they don't keep. They have to be fresh for the ritual to work. So they had to wait for the opportune moment to get this tear from Syrena so the ritual will work, because they are close to the fountain now. So Blackbeard tells Syrena to look at all the corpses of her fellow kin that are just dead all around these pools. There's a whole bunch of them. So obviously it gives the impression that there were plenty of people who have come for the Fountain of Youth before with these mermaids here getting the tears at this location. But these mermaid corpses, just like I talked about last episode where we had the actual fleshy mermaid corpses, now we have these skeletal mermaid corpses and remains, and they're so well done too. They all look so good. It's really crazy how good they look. But Blackbeard, of course, is kind of giving Syrena the stakes of what's going to happen. You're either going to give us the tear here, or we're going to leave you here to die like your sisters. That's what we're going to do. So Blackbeard says, "Staked out to die, to dry in the sun, only half in the water, not enough to live, but just enough to make the dying slow. Think on it. Your people murdered, harvested for their tears. Syrena, won't you cry?" And Syrena just tells him, "All die, even you. Soon, I hear. And then Blackbeard gets pissed, and he's like, listen. And he walks over to her. He's like, listen. Can you not hear your sisters scream? Do you not hear them? And there's kind of like shrieks that are kind of echoing in the background of this scene. But of course, Syrena is staying very strong here. She does not want to relent and give Blackbeard and the crew this tear. But Blackbeard says, we need but one tear. And he says, vile creature. And he slaps her. And Philip, of course, is being held by the quartermaster. And Philip tries to, get away. But Ezekiel starts yelling stuff out. He's like, chop off her fingers one by one. And then Garhang's like, choke her. Another one of the pirates is like, cut out the tears from behind her eyes. And Philip finally gets free of the quartermaster, and he asks Angelica, is like, where's your voice in this? And Angelica tells Blackbeard, maybe she'll have a change of heart when the sun rises. And Blackbeard says, oh, aye, she will burn, but I cannot wait for the sun. Perhaps we should build a fire. And Philip says, no. And then Blackbeard's like, do not contest me, cleric. And Philip's like, you will not torture her. And Angelica says, we need only one tear. And Blackbeard says, I will tear every scale from her body one by one if I see fit. If that displeases you, go pray. And Philip's like, I was wrong. Not every soul can be saved. Yours cannot. And Blackbeard's like, behold, gentlemen, a man formerly of faith. And, Philip claps back. He's like, that vile creature, as you call her, is worth 100 of you. And Blackbeard's like, oh, you care for her. And then it finally dawns on him, and Blackbeard's like, you fancy her. And do not deny what is clear to my eyes. Question is, does she fancy you? So now Blackbeard's called on, and he thinks he has a way to get this tear from Syrena by using Philip. And he looks at Syrena, and Syrena looks away, and Blackbeard's like, by God, she does. We are in luck. And he says, bring forth a tear. And the quartermaster grabs Philip, and Blackbeard's now holding out a knife pointed at Philip, so we get the impression that, either Syrena cries here to save Philip or Philip dies. So he says, bring forth a tear or witness the death of this poor soul. And Scrum's holding out a vial to collect that tear in case she does cry. And then Philip is like, Syrena, if you could manage a tear, I would be grateful. And she just sits there and does not relent. But Blackbeard says, sadness, yes, but no sorrow, yet. And he goes to walk over to Philip, and Angelica's like, not by your hand, father. And Blackbeard just says, time and tide wait for none, quartermaster. And he gives the quartermaster the knife, and then, the quartermaster just kills Philip, and Philip just falls on the ground. He's dead. And, we get a look at Syrena, and she still does not cry. And Blackbeard's like, ooh, aye, mermaids are tough. A lot of them. Tie her up like the others. And I love he walks over to Philip and, kicks his body. He's like, and get rid of this. So we see in the background of the shot, the pirates tying Syrena up to that tree. And Blackbeard walks over to Angelica, and he's like, you are confident. And Angelica's like, I am a woman. So is she. And then we get this scene of some of the zombies throwing Philip's body into this, hill or whatever, this hole. So Philip is dead, actually. We'll find out what actually happens to Philip in just a few minutes. But we have a really great scene here. We're back to Jack, Gibbs, Barbossa, and the rest of the Providence crew as they make their way toward the fort. And we have this great scene between Gibbs and Jack. And Gibbs is like, what's your play, Jack? Throwing in with Barbossa. And then Jack's like, there is a girl. And He's like, a female of the opposite sex. And then Gibbs is like, when is there not? And Jack's like, perhaps I should say damsel. And then Gibbs is like, you're rescuing a damsel? Well, there's a first. And then Jack's like, yes, but it's just that I may have caused said damsel some manner of harm many moons ago. And then Gibbs is like, out with it. And then Jack's like, Gibbs, this is the woman from Seville. And then Gibbs is like, ah, you pretended to love her. Then you left her and broke her heart. And then Jack's like, worse. I may have had, briefly, mind you, stirrings. And then Gibbs is like, stirrings? And Jack's like, stirrings. And then Gibbs like, what? Like feelings? And then Jack's like, no, not so far as feelings. Not quite all the way to feelings. More like, alright, feelings, damn you. And Gibbs is like, and you left her still. Ooh, that's low. I love how Jack just like, he has this look on his face as he turns away from Gibbs. And he's just like, thank you. He walks away. But we finally make it toward the fort. So everyone's made it there. We regroup with Barbossa. And I love how Jack walks over to Barbossa, and he's like, stealth over force. I'll take it from here on account of your condition. And he kind of like gestures to Barbossa's peg leg, and Barbossa just looks over, he just turns his head to look at Jack with this expression on his face. And then Jack's like, you don't have termites, do you? Barbossa is just like, I appreciate the concern, Jack, but I'll be keeping you company all the same. And he's like, hold here, Lieutenant Commander. Wait for my signal. And then Barbossa begins to move off with Jack following behind him. And now we're in one of my favorite scenes in this movie, which is this heist. Like Jack and Barbossa stealing these chalices. It's so funny. I love them working together. I love how they're both swimming through this lake, and Barbossa just has his crutch up in the air. It's like, oh my god, it's so great. But I love how they just pop out from behind the trees after the guard walks by. Like, it's like a comedy movie at this point, like a buddy comedy. It's so funny. I wonder if they framed it this way on purpose. It's one of the highlights of this movie for me. But Jack and Barbossa stealthily move in toward the camp. I love how Barbossa is like hobbling on his foot. But they see that there's this tent in the middle of the fort, and Barbossa notices the Spaniard. So the main Spaniard, the character who is literally called the Spaniard. He does not have a name in this movie for some reason. But Barbossa's like, there, that one, that be the leader. Make note of his tent, because that's where... No, wait. By God, that must be them right there. And then we see that the chalices are on the table in that tent. And Barbossa and Jack, they crouch down and they go prone in the grass. And they begin to kind of crawl through the grass. And Jack's like, your sword smells funny. And then Barbossa's like, aye, poison from the innards of poisonous toads. And then Jack looks at the sword and he's like... and then Barbossa's like, just a scratch and you're a dead man in minutes. And then Jack's like, would you mind pointing it the other way? And then he's like, I don't like toads. And then so they get up out of the grass and they hide behind this tree. And Barbossa's just like leaning against a tree, like huffing and puffing. And like Jack's like, what are you doing? And Barbossa's like, planning an escape route. Isn't that how you do it? And then Jack's like, yes. Well, sometimes I just improvise. And he runs off toward the tent. And then we see inside the tent, this one Spanish soldier is cleaning the chalices, and he's revealing the words on the chalices. But I love how Jack just like pops up from under the table and just grabs the one chalice. And then the guy finishes cleaning the one chalice and he goes to grab the other one, but it's not there. And then the screen turns, and then you just see Barbossa pulling the other chalice away with his crutch. Like, it's just so funny. Oh, it's just so well. It's so good. But then the guy turns around and he sees the chalice isn't there. Then he looks under the table and no one's there. And then we go back up and Barbossa knocks him out with his crutch. And he's like, now what? And then Jack's like, we stroll out, slow and steady, just like we belong. And I love this scene of Jack and Barbossa just walking normally through the camp. And they encounter this group of Spanish soldiers walking toward them. And then I love how Jack just kind of just nods. And then they turn around, they pull out their swords, and they start fighting this guy off. And a whole bunch of other soldiers come out from behind them. And even though they're outnumbered, Jack and Barbossa are still, taking all these guys out. They take all 3 of these soldiers out. And they sheathe their swords, and then they begin to run away from the fort, but they get stopped by a whole squadron of Spanish soldiers. So now they have been captured. And then we go back over to, you guessed it, Philip Swift, who is somehow still alive. Maybe it's a grace of God that he's still alive. But he wakes up from this ditch that he was thrown in. And he realizes that he wasn't actually killed. He was actually just, stabbed with like a sleeping dart from the quartermaster. But he also has like a cut on his chest. So I guess the quartermaster cut him on the chest instead of the neck. Because in the earlier scene, it's kind of framed that the quartermaster, slices his neck. But it looks like the quartermaster kept him alive for this reason. And you can also kind of see in the earlier scene, Blackbeard kind of knows that this is the plan. So, it is kind of easy to know that Philip wouldn't die just then. And also, they wouldn't kill off Philip like so unceremoniously like that anyway. But yeah, Philip is still alive. He begins to make his way back toward the pools. And at this point, everyone is gone. I guess they're just hiding somewhere. But he finally makes his way back over to the pools and finds Syrena. And he tries to untie her. And he's like, I'm sorry, Syrena. And, Serena's like, Philip, you're alive. And he's like, yes. And, she's like, you came for me. And he frees her finally. And she's like, why? And Philip just says, you're different, are you not? And then Philip's like, do you know not of kindness, compassion? And then we see Syrena sheds a tear. And then out of nowhere, all the pirates just come out of hiding. And they grab Syrena. And they're able to harvest that tear that is falling down Serena's eye. And they have successfully gotten their tear. And Blackbeard comes over and says, tears of sorrow, never. Mermaids be too tough for that. But tears of joy. They say these be the more potent anyway. And of course, at this point, Syrena is thinking that Philip tricked her this whole time. And Philip is like, Syrena, on my word, I had no part in this. And Philip's like, let her go. You don't need her. And then Blackbeard's like, let her go. No. Secure her bonds. We leave her with her own. And they begin to tie her back up to the tree where she was just, tied to just a few moments ago. And, they share Philip and Syrena share one last look before we cut back to Jack and Barbossa, who have now been captured by the Spanish, and they are now tied to these 2 palm trees. And this is one of my favorite. I know I've said like so many times already that these Jack and Barbossa scenes are my favorite scenes in the movie, but this really is one of my favorite scenes in this movie. This is a great Jack and Barbossa scene, and also is a great scene that comes up right after this scene that I love a lot too. But, so Jack asks Barbossa, he's like, how's that escape route working? And then Barbossa's like, here's your chance to improvise. And then Jack's like, I'm attempting it. I might be able to get a hand loose. And then he looks at Barbossa, pulls off his peg leg. And then Jack's like, oh, you've got a knife. That's very good. And Barbossa just pulls off a cork from his peg leg and says, better. And then we find out that he has a nice stash of rum in his peg leg, because why not? Why wouldn't a pirate have some rum hidden in his peg leg? So he begins to drink from his peg leg. I just think it's so funny, but it's also just like so in character, honestly, when you think about it. But Jack is just staring at him. He's like, I want one of those. And Barbossa passes his peg leg to Jack. And Jack says, here's to revenge, sweet and clear. And then Barbossa's like, revenge. And then Jack's like, come, Hector. If you'd wanted the chalices, you'd seen them missing and gone. You were lying in wait for Blackbeard. And Barbossa's like, oh. And he grabs the peg leg back from Jack. And Jack's like, King George, privateer, wig, whole theatrical facade, I'm not buying it. And then Barbossa just says, you weren't there that night. And then Jack says, when the pearl was lost. And then Barbossa says, taken, not lost. And here we have one of my favorite Barbossa moments in the entire franchise. This monologue he's about to deliver is literally one of my favorite Barbossa scenes. It is so, so good. So Barbossa begins and he says, we were off the coast of Hispaniola when we came under attack. No provocation, no warning, no offer of parley. We were peppered with cannon fire. And then the sea beneath the Pearl began to roil. The Pearl was pitching and yawing violently. Every plank, every rail, every spar all at once began to creak. The rigging had come to life. Our own ship turned against us, tangling the crew, wrapping around them like snakes, and wrapping around me leg. But me hands were free and me sword was stand. I am the master of my ship, not Blackbeard. I am the master of my fate, not Blackbeard. So I did what needed done. I survived. And I love that moment so much. I mean, now we finally know what happened to the Pearl fully. Obviously, we knew that Blackbeard did something with it because we saw it in the ship in a bottle earlier in the movie, but now we have the full story of what happened, and also how Barbossa lost his leg. So it's really, really cool. I love this scene so much. Barbossa is just so good at telling like ghost stories, like this, and then back in Curse of the Black Pearl when he's telling Elizabeth the legend of the Aztec coins and everything. Like he's just such a good storyteller, and that's definitely mostly because of Geoffrey Rush. Like Geoffrey Rush's acting and his whole like the way he talks and everything. It's so good. It's so good. But Jack says, so you're not after the fountain. And then Barbossa says, I care not for King George or tavern yarns that give hope for a healed limb. I'd give me left arm for a chance at Blackbeard. And then Jack's like, not your right? And then Barbossa's like, I need my good arm to drive my poisoned blade through his heart. And then Jack finally gets his hands free, and he says, I'll see you get the chance, mate. And now we have another one of my favorite scenes, which is the palm tree escape. I've always loved this scene. Ever since this movie came out, it's always been one of my favorite scenes in this whole movie. It's once again, a certified Jack Sparrow moment, as I call them. But I love how, so Jack begins to kind of shimmy up the tree as he's tied to it. And I love how we have a look from like Barbossa as he kind of climbs up. And you just see this kind of like, this sense of kind of like wonder or something in Barbossa's eyes. It's really cool how he's actually like impressed with Jack. It really is really cool when you think about it. But Jack is making his way up the tree, like all the way up this long palm tree. We see all these looks from Barbossa as he kind of just keeps looking up and up and up at Jack. And Jack finally reaches the top of the palm tree somehow. And he's balancing on the palm tree. It's beginning to sway in the breeze. But he ties the rope around this coconut, and he begins swinging the coconut like a lasso. and he throws it, and it kind of ties around another palm tree, and he begins to pull on that rope and pulls that palm tree closer to him, and it kind of bends and bends his way, and then as it finally has enough force, you see this whole palm tree like at a 45-degree angle, and then we see the Spanish, they notice this palm tree that is leaning very not naturally, and they're like, the prisoner's escaping. And Jack finally lets go, and the tree snaps back into position and sends Jack flying into the air, and he lands on another palm tree. And the Spanish are like, he's escaping, fan out, find him, I want him alive. So all the Spanish troops are now running out into the jungle, distracted by Jack, and we see Groves, he's making his way through, and he finds Barbossa and, frees him. He's like, I figured that was the signal, and he begins to cut Barbossa loose. And then we see all the Spanish soldiers kind of, moving around the jungle, and a few coconuts fall, and one of them falls on one of the soldiers and knocks them out. And they look up into the palm tree, and Jack jumps down on the rope, and he begins swinging around the palm tree, with He's a Pirate playing in the background. He begins to just kick them, he knocks them all out, and he finally makes his way down to the ground. As all the Spanish are charging on him, he pulls the rope down, and he begins to tie it around all these soldiers, and as he runs around the palm tree, and he finally pulls them all together and yanks the rope tight, and they're all stuck to the palm tree. So once again, a certified Jack Sparrow moment. And everyone at this point has made it back to the camp with all the other Providence crew members. And Barbossa's giving the orders to move out. The enemy is soon upon us. And Jack finally regroups with everyone, and Barbossa's like, I'm sorry about the chalices, Jack, but I have an appointment to keep. I'll not be going back. And then Jack just says, no need. And he pulls up the 2 chalices, and he's like, shall we have a drink? And then Barbossa's like, we'll drink at the fountain. Then we go back over to the next day, where we have a great, beautiful, sweeping shot of this gorgeous landscape. And we meet back up with the crew of the Queen Anne's Revenge. Angelica has Jack's compass in her hand. And then out of nowhere, she has a sword pointed across her throat. And we see Jack Sparrow has turned up and met back up with them. And Angelica says, how is it we can never meet without you pointing a sword at me? And then Blackbeard says, you brought the chalices, Sparrow. And then Jack's like, aye, oi. And then out of nowhere comes Gibbs with a wild boar and the 2 chalices strapped to the boar. So really great. There's actually once again, there is a whole featurette on this scene with the wild boar, which I think is really funny. Because this was a wild boar. Like there was a animal trainer or something on the set with them to kind of control the boar, but it was a wild boar. It would just run off and take you. So Kevin McNally had to steer this boar into the shot and kind of hold it tight during the scene. And Angelica's like, I see you brought a friend. And Jack's like, I did. And Blackbeard says, and the one-legged man, he is near, aye. And then Jack just says, aye. And then Jack's like, now, before I go, just handing them over, I do have 1 or 2 conditions. And then Blackbeard's like, name them. And then Jack's like, firstly, I'll be having my compass back. No, that's secondly. Firstly, upon your word, you will bring no harm to Angelica. And then Blackbeard's like, I'll make you no vows to the likes of you, Sparrow. But it costs me nothing to admit that she was never in harm's way. And then Jack's like, secondly then, priorly firstly, I'll be having me compass back. Please, I do deserve it. Do you have any idea how difficult it was to catch that filthy pig? Not the big one, the 4-legged one. And Angelica relents and gives Jack the compass back. He's like, thank you. And thirdly, Mr. Beard. Love how he calls him Mr. Beard. And Jack's like, there are times, not very often, when I do reflect upon my heinous misdeeds. Chief among them, I note how poorly I have treated Mr. Gibbs, my loyal first mate. And then Gibbs is like, aye, now that you bring it up. And Jack's like, left him to rot in jail, I did. Didn't care. Still don't. But point being, you must let him go free. And then Blackbeard just stares at him. He's like, is that it? And then Jack's like, I think so. And then Jack's like, quick, or the pig runs, and good luck getting those chalices. And then Gibbs is like, Jack, if it's all the same to you, I'd be just as... And then Blackbeard just says, done. And then Jack's like, release the swine. And Gibbs grabs both the chalices off before the wild boar just takes off into the jungle. I love this scene because I love how Jack's like, how poorly I've treated my loyal first mate, Mr. Gibbs. Left him to rot in jail like I did. Didn't care. Still don't. Like, I honestly feel bad for Gibbs. But I think this is so funny. But Gibbs hands the chalices over to Blackbeard, and he's like, perhaps if you don't mind, I might just tag along with you folk for a while. But they all kind of shrug him off, and Jack gives Gibbs the compass, and he's like, this will lead you to freedom, mate. And then the crew of the Revenge, along with Jack, begin to make their way toward the fountain, and Gibbs goes off to wherever the compass points him. And now we are finally making our way toward the fountain, so Jack is in the lead again. He's like, I could have sworn it was somewhere right around here. And he moves through these really giant leaves, which are really beautiful. And then, on the edges of his vision, he sees this droplet of water that's moving up a leaf in front of him. And he's like, that's weird. So he goes over and picks up that water droplet, and it begins to kind of move up his fingers on his hand as he kind of turns it around and begins to float in the air before it catches on the tip of his finger, and he looks through the water droplet at the rock face in front of him, and he squints into it, and he sees that symbol that we saw on the Malkoon map and also on the map in Ponce de Leon's bedroom as well. It was also on that map. But the water droplet begins to float up into the air, and we see that big giant symbol carved on the rock face. And then we look under it, and there is this kind of like hidden like cavern beneath it. And then we begin to press on into this kind of almost underwater cavern as the whole crew kind of makes their way down this kind of like open cave. It's a really, really gorgeous location too. But we make our way inside the caves, and I love how they're all just trudging through here. And Solomon, he goes up and touches one of the stalactites or stalagmites or whatever, and one of them just falls down and just stabs in the back of one of the pirates and just kills him. And Solomon just looks around, and one of the he's like, we must not stop. And they just keep moving, and they just leave that guy there. But it's great. But they make their way to this kind of open like cavern at the edge of this tunnel, and they find out at the dead end. And Jack's like, dead end. And then Blackbeard's like, dead end? And Jack's like, dead end. And Angelica's like, Jack, I'm starting to think you don't have any idea where you're going. And Jack's like, it's not the destination so much as the journey, they say. And Jack's like, chalices, if you please. And the quartermaster gives Jack the chalices. And then we have this moment of Jack like thinking he knows what he's doing, and he raises the chalices up in the air, and then he just like, stand back. And he just kind of holds them in the air, and then he clinks them together, and the sound kind of vibrates off the cave walls. And everyone just like stands there waiting for something to happen. And he clinks them again. And then Angelica's like, Jack, have you ever, in fact, seen with your own eyes the fountain of youth? And then Jack's like, I'm sorry, what was the question? Could you repeat the question, please? And then Blackbeard's like, quartermaster. And Quartermaster pulls out a pistol and Jack's like, no, and he puts the chalices up to block the gunshot. And the bullet ricochets off the chalices, and then Jack's like, wait, and he looks at the chalices and sees the words Aqua on the one, and then it says Davida on the other one. So he holds them both together, and he just says Aqua, Davida. And then the cave begins to rumble, and then we see all this water that is beginning to move into this cave on the ground. Very not natural for water to move this way in these streams, and it kind of pulls over to where Jack is standing, and it moves up the walls and moves all the way onto the ceiling and makes this kind of like big puddle, this like little pond of water on the ceiling of the cave. And then we see a bird fly through it. So Jack kind of looks up at it, and he looks back. He's like, Master Scrum, do you mind? And then Scrum just kind of bends down, and Jack just stands on his shoulders to get up to this little puddle in the ceiling, and he puts his sword through it, and his sword just gets sucked right through the kind of portal, and then Jack gets sucked through it up into the water, and then he comes up into this very foggy area, and he looks in front of him, and he begins to walk forward, and he grabs his sword off the ground, and the camera pans up, and then we get the reveal of the Fountain of Youth, and this beautiful, beautiful like setting, and this whole beautiful like location, and the design is fantastic. Like it really is so cool. And if you look back at some of the bonus features, or just look up some like concept art for this film, there were a lot of ideas for how the Fountain of Youth would look. Like there were some really, really crazy ones where it was like this gigantic like tower of water, and there's like these other ones with these big man-made structures built around it, like this big like open pool of water. There's all these different ideas. If you look it up, you'll see so many different pieces of concept art. But they eventually settled on this one because it felt like the most real, because it's something that could have been there just so naturally, like this rock that just has this water trickling down through it. And once it was found, they kind of built this little kind of temple around it that you can kind of see the remains of. You can still see those columns that are standing there. And then if you look closer, you can kind of see more of the actual rock work and temple that's kind of built more around it. But yeah, I really love this, like, this version of the Fountain of Youth they went with. I think having it something so simple and something that could be just easily discovered by some random person, and kind of having it like a natural wonder almost, instead of having it be something that was more kind of man-made and built onto. I think it looks really nice and really natural, and really just, it gives you that sense of intrigue and wonder, and it really is great. And I love how above it there's just this really nice kind of opening of the sky, and all the kind of leaves and vines growing down into that kind of chamber. It's really, really beautiful. But Jack begins to walk toward it as everyone else begins to kind of surface through that ceiling portal, water portal thing. And it does make me wonder, is there an easier way to get through there instead of having to clamber onto someone? And like, how do they all get through it so quick? That's what I've always tried to figure out. But everyone begins to kind of make it in. So Angelica and Blackbeard surface in, and then Scrum and the cabin boy come in, and then the rest of the crew makes their way into here as well. It's just a really nice, beautiful, mysterious location with all the fog kind of surrounding it. And these really, really awesome, you can tell how old it is too, because there's on the ground in the kind of pool around the fountain, there's these big giant like stones that have all this patterning on them that have kind of eroded out of the ground, that are now kind of lopsided. So it's really cool because it shows how old it is, how this must have been discovered hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of years ago by the people who first found it. And now everything's kind of fallen apart. And it has this really nice, beautiful sense of like kind of nature over reclaiming the Fountain of Youth. I think it's really, really cool. And I love how they went with this aesthetic for it. And as Jack begins to walk toward the central fountain, which is that big kind of circular rock, donut-shaped rock, I guess, with the water, the little droplet of water coming down the middle of it, we see a bunch of skeletons lining the kind of the hill that it rests on, with a bunch of different ages of armor too. Like we see like kind of like older armor, like newer kinds of armor, more kind of conquistador-esque helmets, and it really just shows how there's been so many people who have come here over the years, and I really like that aging. It works really, really well. But Jack begins to try to touch the water, and Blackbeard interrupts him. He's like, "Sparrow, I'll be the first to taste those waters." And then Angelica turns around, and she just says, "Father." And then we see this shot, and I love it. This might be one of my favorite shots in this whole movie. We see this shot of Blackbeard on the left side of the screen, looking at Angelica, and then we see on the right side of the screen, there's all this fog and all this mist. And then we see slowly out of the mist on the right side of the screen, we see a silhouette of a figure that slowly rises, and we can slowly see their form approaching in the mist. And it is just so cool. You can just slowly see the person approaching, and then Blackbeard just says, "The one-legged man." And then the quartermaster just nods to him. And then Angelica's like, "You brought him here?" And then Jack's like, "Would I do that?" And then we hear Barbossa's voice. He says, "Edward, teach." But yeah, it's so cool how that shot is framed, where you can just slowly see Barbossa coming out of the fog. I love that shot so much. I don't know why. It's just so cool and so eerie. So Barbossa and the Providence crew begin to move over, and Barbossa begins, "Edward, teach. For crimes committed on the high seas, by the authority granted me by His Majesty the King, and with a goodly amount of personal satisfaction, I hereby place you in the custody of the court, and declare you to be my prisoner." And then Blackbeard's like, "My trick's out, is that it?" And then Barbossa says, "Such crimes do include, but are not limited to, piracy, treason, murder, torture of the most heinous sort, including the brutal theft of one used, twisted, hairy right leg." And then Barbossa pulls out his sword, and Blackbeard says, "You dare face this sword?" And he pulls out the sword of Triton, and Barbossa's like, "This far away from your ship? Aye." And then Blackbeard says, "Aye, that be the cold breath of fate I feel down my nape. But I'll have one last fight, by God. Kill 'em all!" And everyone begins to pull out their swords. The crew of the Revenge, the crew of the Providence, everyone begins to pull out their swords and about to fight. But Jack's like, whoa, hang on a minute. And Jack just walks in the middle of all of them. And he's like, I just need to understand something. And he walks over in between Barbossa and Blackbeard. He's like, "Right, so you will fight against them, they will fight against you, all on the account of him wanting to kill him? Where's the sense?" And then Scrum just shrugs, and Jack's like, "Exactly." He's like, "I say, let them fight each other while we lay back, watch them, have a drink, play some wagers, eh?" And then Scrum's like, "Aye," and then Scrum just sheathes his sword. And then we go back over to Blackbeard, and Barbossa's like, "Kill him!" And Blackbeard's like, "No quarter!" And then they begin to fight. They duel. The Providence crew shoot off their muskets toward the people, and now we have this crazy huge fight around the Fountain of Youth. So we have the crew of the Revenge fighting the crew of the Providence. And we see some great shots of Solomon fighting, of Gillette and Groves fighting, Ezekiel in here as well, the cabin boy, the zombies, everyone's fighting. And of course, at the middle of it, we have this great duel between Barbossa and Blackbeard around in this little pool. I love how so Blackbeard kind of like grabs Barbossa's crutch and hits him in the face. And then, out of nowhere, Blackbeard goes to slash at Barbossa, and Gillette walks right in front of him, and Blackbeard kills Gillette. And we have our first legacy character death in this movie. And Gillette's body just kind of falls on Barbossa, and Barbossa's like, "Get off me!" And Gillette's lifeless corpse falls to the ground. And I understand Gillette, of course, he hasn't been in Pirates of the Caribbean since the first movie. And even in the first movie, he had like 2 minutes of screen time. But like, I mean, he's been around since the first movie, and he just dies so unceremoniously. It really makes me so sad, because like, he literally comes out of nowhere in that shot and gets killed. Like, I don't really understand why they did him so dirty. Like, he didn't deserve to die like that, especially because, you know, he's been in the movies since Curse of Black Pearl. I mean, he was only in Curse of Black Pearl before this, but like, even still, like, he is a legacy character. He's been around at this point for, you know, well, this was 2011, so about 8 years. But still, I'm just so sad they did Gillette so dirty, and they just kill him off like just like that. Just out of nowhere, he just walks in, boom, gets killed. Like, it makes me so sad. Poor Gillette. Gillette deserved better. Poor Gillette. Rest in peace. But the fight continues on. We get the zombies taking out some people, and the quartermaster zombie kills one of the Providence crew members, and they fall on the ground, and their sword is out, and Philip goes and uses that guy's sword to cut his binds off his hands so he can escape. But while he's trying to struggle with that, the cabin boy runs over and actually frees Philip. And Philip takes his chance to run away, but I don't know why he does this. He goes and tries to fight this one Providence crew member, and the guy just slashes him in the stomach. Like, Philip, that was your own fault. You could have just ran and not engaged the guy, and you would have been fine. Instead, he goes and engages this guy with a sword while he has no weapon and gets injured. Like, that is so on you, Philip. That is completely your fault. I'm sorry. If you just chose not to engage, you would have been fine. But of course, we had to have him get injured. But Philip, now actually injured this time, not falsely injured, he tries to run away, of course, going back to Syrena, because where else would he go? Then the fight continues on as Philip runs away. Angelica yells over to Scrum, like, "Scrum, the chalices!" And Scrum tosses her the bag with the chalices over. And while Angelica and Scrum make it up the hill, and Scrum is stopped by Jack, who points out his sword, and he's like, "Hand it over, the tear. There's a good lad." And then I love how Scrum's like, "I'm more afraid of her than I am of you." And then Scrum and Jack begin to fight for a quick second, but Jack manages to get the tear from Scrum, but he's stopped by Angelica, who's pointing her sword out at Jack, and Angelica's like, "Hand it over, there's a good lad." And then Scrum comes over and also points his sword out at Jack. So now Jack is outnumbered, and he's like, "The chalices, if you please." And then Angelica just laughs. It's like, "Sorry, Jack. I told you, I need years, and now yours will do." And he throws the tear up in the air, and Scrum throws his sword up to free one of his hands to grab the tear, but Jack grabs Scrum's sword and points the two swords he now has at Angelica and Scrum. And he's like, "Aha!" And then he throws one of the swords up again. Angelica throws her sword up, and Jack grabs the tear, and he kicks the sack out of Scrum's hands. And Angelica and Jack begin to run over to grab the chalices. Then we go back over to Philip, who has somehow already made it back to the pools where Syrena was left to die. So he's made very good time. And he makes it back over to Syrena, who is, well, pretty much almost dead. She's been sitting here for a while now. And she's pale. She's, her eyes are closed. Philip thinks that she's dead. But Philip goes down and cradles her face, like, "My God, you will not take her. If you have taken her, you will give her back." And he goes to free her, and then he keeps muttering, "Give her back, please, please." And then Syrena opens her eyes, and then she sees Philip, and then out of nowhere she goes right down into the pool. If you remember earlier, Blackbeard said the pools do run deep, so we do get the shot of Syrena swimming down through this pool, which ends up leading to a place. Well, it ends up leading to the Fountain of Youth. Then we go back over to the fight that's going on between Blackbeard and Barbossa, the duel between them, which is so cool. I love how Barbossa uses his crutch in his fighting style, but Blackbeard grabs the crutch and he slices it in half, and Barbossa kind of staggers back. And then Blackbeard's like, "I expected fate to put up more of a fight, eh?" And then I love how Barbossa kind of like hits Blackbeard in the face with his crutch, and I love how he begins to use the remains of his crutch to fight off Blackbeard. But Blackbeard is able to take Barbossa down pretty easily because Barbossa, of course, is now handicapped. But he literally sweeps the leg, just like the Karate Kid, and Barbossa falls down onto the ground. And Blackbeard holds out the sword of Triton, pointed at Barbossa, and Barbossa's just smiling at Blackbeard. And Blackbeard just says, "I will not have that smile on your face as I strike you down." And then Barbossa just says, "Take a gander, Edward Teach." And then we get this pan-up shot to Blackbeard as he turns around and looks behind him. And then out of the fog comes the Spaniard and the whole Spanish armada that has come on this journey to reach the fountain. And of course, in this, we also get the great music for the Spanish that they have in this movie. One of the best themes that they developed for this film. Hans Zimmer popping off as usual. I love the theme that they made for the Spanish in this movie. But Jack and Angelica, now having the chalices, they see all the Spanish arriving. And now they've all arrived. The whole fight has pretty much just ceased to happen. Everyone's just kind of stopped fighting because there's a whole bunch of Spanish soldiers that just arrived. And they all begin to kind of circle around everyone. They're all around, literally 360, around the Fountain of Youth, kind of blocking everyone in. And in this moment, Groves, who is still alive, thankfully, up to this point, Groves walks up and he throws his sword down and he pulls out this Union Jack flag. And he says, "This land is hereby forever claimed in the glorious name of His Majesty, King George..." And he's stopped by a gunshot. And we see Theodore Groves, also dies by the Spaniard's hand. The Spaniard was the one who shot him. The Spaniard said, "Someone make a note of that man's bravery." And now we have witnessed the death of our second legacy character. And this one hurts a lot more. I mean, what I do appreciate is Groves has, I guess, more of a ceremonial death than Gillette does, but it still hurts me that both of them die in this movie. Just, especially with, and Groves, if you remember, like, Groves has been in more movies than Gillette. Groves was in Curse of Black Pearl for one scene, but then, of course, he came back for Outworld's End, which had a decent chunk of screen time in Outworld's End. And, he comes back in this movie and he sadly dies just like Gillette did. At least he had more of a better fitting death scene than Gillette. And he's like, Gillette just gets killed out of nowhere and just dies. Like, I just feel bad for him, just because he's been around for so long. And maybe they had Groves do this because he had more screen time and he was more developed character, and they gave him a better death scene to kind of justify that. But still, like, why'd you have to kill off both of them? Like, it just makes me sad because, like, they've just been around for so long and they just die. At least Groves has a good death scene, but, like, it still makes me so sad that they're both dead. Like, poor Theodore Groves. Like, you have to remember this too. Like, that guy survived so much. Like Theodore Groves, he survived somehow. Survived the destruction of the Endeavor at the end of Outworld's End. Like, he somehow jumps off that ship and makes it away and makes it back to land somehow and survives. And then he dies here. Like, it just makes me so sad. I feel so bad. Who knows? Maybe Groves ended up surviving, because after this scene we can see some of the Providence soldiers are carrying his body away. Maybe he does miraculously survive his gunshot wound, but up to this point we no further information about Groves or Gillette, so both of them here are so far canonically dead in the Pirates of the Caribbean timeline, which makes me sad. But we'll give one last salute to Theodore Groves and Gillette, but we'll move on here. So the Spaniard moves toward Jack and Angelica, who, of course, Jack is holding the chalices, but as the Spaniard begins to walk over, Jack just gives the chalices to Angelica, and Jack just walks away. And the Spaniard goes over to Angelica. It's like, "Senorita, the chalices, por favor." And she doesn't hand them over, so two of the Spanish men grab the chalices away from Angelica, and the Spaniard grabs them, and he holds them up in his hands, and he yells out, "Only God can grant eternal life, not this pagan water." And he drops both the chalices on the ground, and he steps on both of them and, dents them both. And he picks them up and throws them into the water, and they sink down into another one of those pools that happens to be very, very deep. And then he yells out to his soldiers. He says, "Men, destroy this profane temple." And then the Spanish soldiers begin to pretty much topple the fountain. The zombies are, at this point, the only people who are trying to clap back at them, because everyone else is just still standing there stunned. But they begin to pull down the pillars. They begin to just destroy everything, pretty much. But the Spaniard walks over to Blackbeard as all this is beginning to happen. And so as the Spanish are, beginning to destroy the fountain, we now realize why they wanted to come in the first place. It wasn't to get the gift of the fountain or have, get that power. It was to destroy it. That's the whole reason they came. They couldn't believe that this thing, was opposing their faith. Obviously, at this point, the Spanish were very Catholic in this time period. And they couldn't believe that something like this would exist and also, grant eternal life. They felt it like was a slap in the face to God. So they came all this way with that information they found from that fisherman at the very beginning of the movie, just to destroy the Fountain of Youth. That's their whole goal, was to destroy it, because it was a complete just slap in the face to their faith. So it is cool because the whole movie you're led to think that they're here to get the power of the fountain, just like everyone else is. But it was just to destroy it, which I think is a cool turn, but also, it makes sense because the Spanish were very Catholic at this time in the world. So they begin to destroy it. They have all these ropes, all these grappling hooks they brought with them, and they begin to pull down pillars and columns, and everything begins to crumble. But the Spaniard, he moves toward Blackbeard, and he pulls out his sword and points it at Blackbeard. And we can see in the back of this shot, we can see the two soldiers who are pulling away the corpses of Gillette and Groves. Once again, rip. But the Spaniard says to Blackbeard, "You are a fool. You seek in this place what only faith can provide." And then behind Blackbeard, we can see Barbossa is, getting himself back up, standing back up. And Blackbeard says, "Faith. In faith there is light enough to see, but darkness enough to blind." And he holds his hand up with the sword of Triton, and then out of nowhere, someone slices his hand, and he drops the sword. And he looks at the blood coming out of the gash on his hand, and he turns around and says, "What devilry is this?" And he turns around, and Barbossa stabs him right through his chest with his poison blade. And all Barbossa says is, "For the pearl." And of course, Angelica is watching this all happen, and she is now shocked that Blackbeard, her father, is now dying from this poisoned blade that Barbossa has stabbed him with. But we can see, of course, this was Barbossa's whole arc in this movie. It wasn't to get the fountain. And of course, we knew that from the earlier conversation with Jack and Barbossa when they were captured. But this whole quest, the whole thing, the whole, getting with the privateer, becoming a privateer, the King George, all of it was all to get the power to chase down Blackbeard and get revenge. So Barbossa has accomplished what he set out to do. And Angelica begins to run over to Blackbeard, who has, Barbossa's sword stuck in his chest. And she goes to pull it out, but Jack's like, "Angelica, don't! It's poison!" And then, foolishly, Angelica tries to pull it out, and when she pulls it out, she slices her palm, and now she has been poisoned too. So Barbossa just says, "I'm not such the fool to take on Blackbeard without a little venomous advantage." And Angelica turns around toward Jack, and now Jack is worried because he wasn't expecting Angelica to die, and now his whole perspective changes, and he wants to save Angelica. So he goes to turn around and look for the chalices that the Spaniard threw in the water. And while he's doing that, at this point, the crew of the Providence that survived have kind of just left, and Barbossa is pretty much alone at this point. He picks up the sword of Triton off the ground, and he says, "I claim Blackbeard's ship and crew, and this sword, payment for my missing limb." And then he begins to walk away, and the rest of the crew of the Queen Anne's Revenge, the people who survived, they begin to follow Barbossa as their new captain. And as Jack searches for the chalices in the water, we see the Spanish are now destroying the fountain. They're pulling these columns down. They threw the ropes around them, and they're beginning to pull them down. The quartermaster zombie and the gunner zombie are trying to stop them. But unfortunately, one of the pillars begins toppling down, and it falls right on top of the gunner zombie and the quartermaster zombie, and it also completely destroys the fountain. Completely destroys the rock, the actual Fountain of Youth. Completely destroys it. And Jack looks up, and now we just have all this debris floating down in the air. And it's a really cool moment because, everything's destroyed, and now it's all just silent, and there's this debris just kind of raining down from the sky. And then we just get one last shot of the Spaniard, who he blesses himself before he orders his men to leave, because now their task is complete. They destroyed the fountain. They can go back home. And at this point, Jack, he's still looking for the chalices, but out of nowhere, Syrena comes up with both of the chalices out of the water, and she just says to him, "Do not waste my tear." And she disappears back into the water. So now that Jack has the chalices, he also pulls out the tear from his belt and walks over to Angelica and Blackbeard, who are dying from the poison. So, of course, Jack goes over to where the fountain was, which is now no more because it was completely destroyed. but he bends down all the way to the ground, and there's this little tiny hole with the water still dripping into it. So he's able to get a few drops of that water in both of the cups, and then he opens the tear vial and puts the tear in one of the chalices. And he runs over to Angelica and Blackbeard. And of course, so Jack, he wants to save Angelica, but he's not letting that come across. So he has the two chalices in his hand, and he's about to pull a scheme on Angelica and Blackbeard here. So he goes over to them, and he's like, drink this. This one has the tear. And he gives that one to Angelica. And he's like, you must drink the other. And then Angelica's like, no. And then Jack's like, I cannot save you both. One of you must sacrifice. And Angelica looks at Blackbeard and he's like, you take it, father, for your soul. Jack says to Blackbeard, Captain Teach, she's dying. You must save your daughter. And he holds out the one without the tear to Blackbeard. And Blackbeard looks at the one that Jack is holding in front of him, and he points to it. He's like, this one takes life. This one has the tear and gives life. Aye. And then Jack's like, aye, hurry. And then Jack knew what was going to happen. So he was holding that one out to Blackbeard, and he said that was the one without the tear. And he knew Blackbeard so well, he knew that Blackbeard would try to save himself and not Angelica. So what does Blackbeard do? He goes and grabs the one that Jack says has the tear in it, which is the one that he was holding away from Blackbeard. But what Jack did, and Blackbeard doesn't know until after he drinks it, is that Jack pulled a switcheroo. And he knew that Blackbeard was going to save himself. So he originally offered Blackbeard the cup with the tear and said that was the one without the tear. And he knew that Blackbeard wouldn't want to save Angelica. He would want to save himself. So Jack has tricked Blackbeard. Greatest trick of all time. Literally kills Blackbeard here with this trick. But he doesn't reveal it yet. But after Blackbeard drinks the one with the tear, so he thinks, he tells Angelica to drink the other one, and she does. Even though Jack tells her not to, he has to commit to the act, of course. So Angelica drinks the other one, and now the ritual has been complete. Both chalices have been drank. Angelica says, I love you, father. And then Jack kind of, saddened, he begins to walk away. But then, when he's walking away, he begins to reveal everything. And he says, wait a minute. He's like, in fact, it might have been the other way around. He's like, that one had the tear, that one had the other bit. And then Blackbeard's like, trickster, devil. And then Angelica looks and sees this water that's beginning to kind of swirl around Blackbeard's feet. And Angelica looks down at her hand, and she sees the cut on her palm disappears magically. So she turns around to Jack, and she's like, you bastard, how could you? And then Jack's like, your father saved you. Perhaps his soul may be redeemed, eh? So now we have the reveal. Jack tricked both of them and saved Angelica and doomed Blackbeard to die. Of course, another certified Jack Sparrow moment, if I will say. But yeah, I think it's so cool how, Jack knew that Blackbeard wouldn't want to save his daughter. He would want to save himself. So the fact that he literally offered Blackbeard the one with the tear, knowing that potentially he could have drank that one and doomed Angelica, but he knew Blackbeard wouldn't do that. He knew Blackbeard would save himself. So, yeah, a classic Jack Sparrow moment of trickery. Fantastic. But then this water begins to erupt out of the ground around the fountain, and it begins to make its way down to Blackbeard and pretty much kind of catches him in the middle of a water tornado almost, as it begins to, like a hurricane, as it begins to kind of whirl around Blackbeard, literally physically taking the years of life off of him. And we get this gruesome shot of Blackbeard literally just decomposing. So we see the skin being pulled off his body, we see the blood coming out, and literally everything gets pulled off of him, and we see the skeleton of Blackbeard reach out toward Angelica. You can see like the ring still on his finger, but the literal skeleton, whatever's left of Blackbeard, he reaches out toward Angelica before the corpse then just falls to the ground lifeless as the water ceases back. And now Blackbeard is no more. Blackbeard is finally dead, leaving Jack and Angelica alone in the ruins of the fountain. But yeah, what a gruesome death scene too. Also the music, didn't talk about the music. The music in that scene is also fantastic as well. The Blackbeard theme that we hear earlier in the movie, and also that part of the theme that we hear there. Very, very good. Another Hans Zimmer banger. You know, I've criticized the soundtrack on this one, I know, but like there are some really great ones. The new themes that were made for this movie are really fantastic and just really, really good. But after that scene, we go back over to the pools where Philip is still he's just chilling there. He's still dying. And then out of nowhere, Syrena surfaces back up from that pool right in front of Philip. And Philip's like stunned that she came back. And Syrena's like, "You are hurt." And then Philip's like, "In body only. My mind is at peace because of you." And Syrena's like, "Me?" And Philip's like, "Yes. I was lost. The wind, the tides, they ought to renew a man's faith. But for me, only you." And then Syrena says, "Philip, I can save you. You need only ask." And then Philip says, "I seek but one thing." And Syrena's like, "What is that?" And Philip just says, "Forgiveness. If not for me, you would have never been captured." And Syrena just says, "Ask." And Philip just says, "Forgive me." And Syrena kisses Philip and she pulls him down into that pool as the mermaid's theme begins blaring again. And we see a shot of Syrena dragging Philip down through the tunnels down here. And what happens to them? We don't know. That is the last we see of Philip and Syrena in this movie, and also overall. They have not been mentioned once or seen at all since this movie came out. So where did they go? Who knows? I will mention this here. We will be covering it maybe soon. I don't know when we'll be covering it, but we will be covering it at some point. If you know, there is a very infamous screenplay for Pirates of the Caribbean 5 that is floating around. It was written by Terry Rossio. And I think it was put up on Wordplay, but it's also been, which is like a screenwriter site, but like it's also been circulating around the internet for years now. And we will be covering it on this podcast potentially sometime soon, but I will bring it up very quickly that Philip Swift does actually appear in this screenplay as a cartographer. So yeah, it's cool that he was originally going to come back for Pirates 5 if this screenplay actually ended up being the one that was used, but it's not. So this whole screenplay is a completely different version of Pirates 5. We'll cover this sometime after we actually go through Pirates 5, but I just wanted to mention that Philip Swift does appear in this draft. So he would have come back if that draft was used for the movie. But since it was not used, we have no idea where Philip Swift or Syrena ended up. Are they still even alive? Who knows? So we go back to the next scene, which is back with Jack and Angelica, and Jack is rowing Angelica out to this island in the middle of the ocean. And Angelica's like, "I hate you." And then Jack's like, "The bloke who saved your life?" And then Angelica's like, "The years I possess, stolen from my own father." And then Jack's like, I only helped Blackbeard do what any father should have done." And Angelica says, "You are cruel and ignorant." And when they make it to this island, and Jack throws Angelica on the beach, and he gives her a pistol It says 1 pistol, 1 shot, and he throws it on the sand next to her. And Angelica's like, to kill myself before I starve? And Jack's like, there's no trusting you, love. Besides, this is a well-traveled trade route. You can signal a passing ship. Nice callback to Curse of Black Pearl, which I think is very cool. Where he continues, like, or you can just bite the proverbial bullet, as it were. And he begins to walk back to the boat. And Angelica's like, and how will I get free of these bonds? And then Jack's like, you broke free of your bonds half an hour ago, waiting for the precise moment to pounce. And he quickly turns around and blocks a branch that Angelica was swinging at him. And he throws it aside. And Angelica says, admit it, Jack. You still love me. And I love how Jack's like, if you had a sister and a dog, I'd choose the dog. And he goes to walk away. And then, she's trying to plead him to stay. So she ends up making up all this random stuff. And she's like, treasure. There's a chest with jewels. Jewels with the power to rule the wind and tide. And Jack's like, you're making that up. And then she stops him. She's like, wait. And then she just says, I am with And then Angelica just says to Jack, I am with child. Yours. And I love how Jack's eyes go wide. And he's like, I don't recall that we ever had. And Angelica's like, you were drunk. And then Jack's like, I've actually never been that drunk. And Angelica's like, wait. There's something I want to say to you. Something I wanted to say from the moment we first met. And Jack's like, go on then. And Angelica's like, I love you. And then Jack kind of like cradles her face. He's like, as do I. Always have. Always will. And they kind of close the distance to kiss. But right before they kiss, Jack just shrugs off. He's like, I gotta go. And he just runs away. And Angelica shouts after him as he runs toward the boat. And she's like, this is not over. Jack. And Jack pushes the dinghy back into the water and begins to row away. And then out of nowhere, he dodges a gunshot that Angelica fired at him. And he's like, missed. So, of course, now Angelica has wasted her one shot as she is left on the beach here alone. She shouts at him as he rows away, leaving her marooned on an island very similar to Rum Runner Isle back in Curse of the Black Pearl. But quick mention, I think I mentioned it on one of the episodes before. I can't remember which one, but the island that was just shown in that scene that Angelica gets marooned on no longer exists because it has been completely overtaken by the ocean. So it's literally been swallowed by the ocean. I think it happened like a few years ago. Over time, it was slowly and becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. As the kind of tide crept in closer, and now it literally does not exist anymore because the ocean now completely covers that island. So that island is completely non-existent at this point, which is, I feel like it's sad because you can't like go out to the Caribbean like, oh look, that's the location for Pirates 4. You can't say that because you don't even know where it is because it's just underwater, which sucks. But we end that scene and we go back to Barbossa, and he walks over to where the Queen Anne's Revenge was docked back earlier in the movie, if you remember. And Barbossa smiles. He's like, the Revenge is mine. And then we go on deck, and Barbossa is back in his original outfit from the first 3 movies. Iconic Barbossa outfit. He's got the bandana on, everything. He looks just like he did back in the first 3 movies, which is so awesome. It's such an iconic look. And it just makes me so sad that they didn't keep this look for Pirates 5. I understand that in Pirates 5 he gets to be a very rich pirate. I mean, the best pirate in the ocean. And he becomes rich and wants to kind of look that way. But like Barbossa looks the best when he has that iconic outfit on. Like, it's iconic. It's literally iconic. But he puts his hands on the helm, but the cabin boy runs up behind him, and he's like, sir, we found this below decks. And then he hands Barbossa his hat. So I'm guessing during the attack on the Pearl, I'm guessing that they recovered his hat, and they just had it below decks, which is weird. Or maybe it's Angelica's hat, but it is Barbossa's hat. So I mean, maybe Angelica, because there is a different feather in it if you notice. So maybe Angelica was using it, was fixing it, something, who knows. But Barbossa puts his hat back on, and we finally have the look complete again. Ugh, so nice. But he steps forward and he pulls out the Sword of Triton, and the rigging and everything comes down. The sails unfurl, and the wind kind of blows in the sails, and the ship begins to move forward as he thrusts his sword. And all the pirates on deck kind of fall down from the force of it. But he puts it away, he sheaths it, and he says, "All hands, ply to windward! Get cracking, you bloomin' cockroaches!" And we have that iconic Barbossa laugh back again. And he says, "The crown served me well." And he pulls out that kind of document. And he says, "But now, by the gods of sea and sky, make way for Tortuga." And he rips it up and throws it out into the sky. And everyone begins to cheer on deck as the Queen Anne's Revenge now sails under Hector Barbossa's command. And we'll see it return next movie. And we have one more scene here where Jack comes out of the boat on the beach, and he regroups with Gibbs. And I love how he comes on shore, and he immediately just starts berating Gibbs. He's like, "Gibbs, you filthy besotted shellback, you made it." And then Gibbs like, "Aye." And Jack's like, "And I trust we happen to make a bit of profit from our joint enterprise." And I love how Gibbs is just chilling on this tree branch kind of thing. And Gibbs just says, "Feast your eyes." And he brings Jack's attention to the Black Pearl in the ship in a bottle, sitting right next to him. So Jack has now been reunited with the Black Pearl, of course, in a way differently than he originally expected, but Jack looks at the pearl in the bottle, and Gibbs says, "The compass led me straight and true." And then Jack's like, "What of Blackbeard's men guarding the ship?" Gibbs is like, "I employed the self-same maneuver we perfected in New Guinea." And then Jack's like, "Oh." And then Gibbs grabs a bag off the ground, and he's like, "Seemed ashamed to leave an entire fleet behind." And of course, Gibbs took all the ships that were in Blackbeard's ship in a bottle closet. And I love how Jack's like, "Shame indeed." And they laugh. And it does make me wonder, where does this go? Like, in Pirates 5, we don't have any mention of him having all these other ships. Maybe he sold them off to get some money. But it's never brought up again. So where did all these extra ships go? I have no idea. So yeah, maybe they're out there floating somewhere. Who knows? But Jack continues to look in the ship in a bottle. And then we see Jack the monkey again inside the bottle. And Jack's like, "I hate that monkey." And then Gibbs is like, "So the pearl, any idea how to get her out?" And then Jack turns to Gibbs. He's like, "We shall need a crossbow, an hourglass, 3 goats. One of us must learn to play the trumpet while the other one goes like this." And he kind of does that squiggly hand thing. And then Gibbs is like, "I know a man with a goat." And then Jack's like, "Good, then I can go like this." And then we have a short little great scene between Jack and Gibbs as they walk off into the sunset on the shore. And Gibbs is like, "Jack, I have to ask. You had the chalices, the water, the tear. You could have lived maybe forever." And then Jack's like, "The fountain does test you, Gibbs, but better to not know which moment may be your last. Every morsel of your entire being alive to the infinite mystery of it all. And who's to say I won't live forever, eh? Discoverer of the fountain of youth. I have no say in it, Gibbs. It's a pirate's life for me. Savvy?" And then cut to black, and boom, that is the end of Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides. And we have the credits roll. So, of course, directed by Rob Marshall. And I think he did a pretty good job, coming into this. Of course, you can't top the Gore's trilogy. Like, it's untoppable. But it was great to have the whole kind of family back together for this one. Like, even though Rob Marshall came in and took over directing, Jerry Bruckheimer still produced. Like, Mike Stenson and Chad Oman were still there helping to produce as well. Like, Darius Wolski was still director of photography for this one. He was director of photography for the first 3 movies. Penny Rose also came back for a costume designer for this movie. She did all 5 movies, by the way. Unsung hero. It wouldn't be Pirates of the Caribbean without Penny Rose. And of course, Hans Zimmer came back to do the music, which I've also talked about already. And we also had some extra music by Rodrigo and Gabriela, which is a Spanish duo, who also did some extra music for this movie, which can be found on the soundtrack, which I do like. It is cool. It's very nice. But yeah, as the credits begin to roll here, let's cover the end credit scene in this movie, because it can't be a Pirates of the Caribbean movie without an end credit scene. And this end credit scene is a pretty interesting one. So it's about Angelica. So we go back to the island where Angelica is still chilling. For how long at this point, we don't know. But she's laying on the shore. And then, out of nowhere, who would have guessed, the Jack Sparrow voodoo doll comes into shore and she picks it up. How it managed to get to this island, I have no idea. But we see a shot of Angelica looking at the doll before she smiles, and then the movie cuts to black, and that's the end. And unfortunately, we have had nothing come of that. Like, no mention of Angelica at all in the next movie. There has been no mention of Angelica at all since this movie. So that does suck. I kind of wish they would at least talk about some of these things in the next movie. And that's why I say, this movie feels like a side quest with some repercussions for the main story. Because, like, Dead Men Tell No Tales, I'll get into this more when we actually begin Dead Men Tell No Tales, which will be in the next episode. But Dead Men Tell No Tales feels like a true sequel to the first 3 movies, just because it deals with Henry Turner, trying to break Will's curse. And we have, the main characters and their descendants are now the main characters. So it feels more like an actual sequel to the films than this movie does. Despite this movie also being the same thing, nothing comes from this movie. Everything that's set up at the end of this movie doesn't really come to be. Like, what happens to all the ships in the bottles that Gibbs took? We don't see them ever again. What happens to Angelica? What happens with the Jack Sparrow voodoo doll? We don't know. So it's really interesting how nothing comes from those threads. Maybe one day we'll find out if those actually end up being an important thing, but for now, it's still a mystery. And that will be the end of our coverage on Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides. So I've had a lot of fun doing these episodes. Of course, next episode we will begin the 5th and currently final film in the Pirates franchise, Dead Men Tell No Tales. Of course, we know Pirates 6 is in development. Will it actually come to be? When will it come out? We have no idea. So for now, Pirates 5 is our current last film in the franchise. So I'm excited to get to cover that one. I do enjoy Dead Men Tell No Tales, maybe more than most people do. And I will give my reasons for that on the next episode when we start the movie. So for now, thank you all for listening to our coverage on Stranger Tides. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed this episode and also the last 3 episodes we did on Stranger Tides as well. As I said, this is my least favorite Pirates movie, but that doesn't mean that it's not good. There's still some fantastic moments in this movie, still some absolutely fantastic stuff that happens and that occurs, and it's great. So I've had a lot of fun covering this one, and I cannot wait to start covering Dead Men Tell No Tales. I hope you will join me for that one, where we will have as much fun as we can with that movie. I will at least be having fun. I hope I can probably not change your opinions on the movie, but at least we'll kind of hopefully enjoy it together. So hopefully you'll join me next time for Dead Men Tell No Tales. But thank you if you've listened to this episode in full, if you've listened to any of the other episodes, if you've listened to all the episodes, thank you so much. And if you've left a rating or a review anywhere, that I also thank you so much for doing that. If you haven't already, I would plead you to do that because it helps the podcast a lot in many ways. But even if you don't, just listening to this podcast is more than enough. So thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next time with the start of our adventure into Dead Men Tell No Tales. See you then. Podcast of the Caribbean is in no way affiliated with Disney. If you want to send me an email or a question, you can send it over to podcastofthecaribbean@gmail.com. You can also follow this podcast on Instagram at Podcast of the Caribbean and also on Twitter at PodcastPOTC. I post fun content, trivia over there. Make sure you go check those out. But be sure to keep weather eye on the horizon. And always remember, dead men tell no tales.